But I don't know quite how that applies to doctrinal issues. With regard to moral issues, it seems to me there's very definitely that sort of progress and change. Jack, maybe you could say something about the development of doctrine as such. But with regard to moral issues, the way in which human social institutions change so dramatically. For example, the fascinating history of the church's attitude toward taking interest on loans. It's an extraordinary history. And clearly it has changed very significantly as social institutions around money have changed. Our own judge, John Noonan, of the federal court here, wrote a history of that issue many years ago. And in fact, Judge Noonan has just written a new book called, I think it's called How the Church Changes or something. It's just about to be published, in which he looks at a number of issues. But with regard to moral issues, I see that there's no way in which there can be a static holding to one or another doctrine, except perhaps at some very deep level. The question of capital punishment that the bishops are now, once again, very slowly trying to get people interested in, is certainly a question of a development of doctrine. One of the most peculiar questions about development of doctrine seems to go backwards, and it goes back to Julie's question. That is the question of the origin of life. The church's teaching about the origin of life for many, many centuries was fairly simple. It basically was whatever the biologists say. And the biologist was Aristotle. And there wasn't any other biologist to speak of. It was Aristotle. And for Aristotle, the beginning of human life is somewhere in the early months of pregnancy, not at the beginning. And then, lo and behold, in the 19th century, when there began to be microscopic evidence with microscopic investigation of the act of conception in animals, particularly, the idea that life should be counted as beginning from the fertilization of an ovum brought about a change in the church's doctrine. The church had never thought one way or the other about conception until science brought this new evidence of significant changes in the structure of an ovum as a result of fertilization. And so then all of a sudden in the 1870s, Jim, what's the?
I think it's 1848.
1848 is the first. So you begin to have, the first papal.
Oh no, the papal would be Leo XIII in the 18s, Divina Arcana, which was 1870.
There's some Holy Office stuff early on. All of a sudden, we have life beginning at conception, which is contrary to the church's usual teaching, because the biologists said. Now, we've got a lot more data now about what happens to fetuses in the early moments of existence, and because it's possible to change. For example, we now know something that wasn't known in the 19th century, that for the first 3 or 4 days after conception, there is no structural interaction between the cellular components of a fertilized ovum. They're not communicating the way cells learn to communicate a little later. It's, strictly speaking, like a pile of stones. And then they begin to interact in ways that reorganize and begin to align and so forth. Should that be relative to our way in which we consider the beginning of life? In my view, that makes the stem cell research a very different question than any other question. If you're talking about utilization of cells at that period of time, it seems to me those cells are a different sort of thing than the cells a week later. after implantation, when you begin to see actual structural interaction and biochemical interaction between each component of the cellular structure. I think that's a question, as Jack, it's a question of whether a piece of scientific evidence should make us reconceptualize our way of thinking about moral problems. Yes?
I'm not even sure how to ask this, but I find it very confusing about in vitro fertilization
Yes.
and surrogate mothers, and I just wondered if you could sort of talk to those.
Lots of things to say about it. The Catholic teaching, quite literally, fertilization as the primary medical technique for conception apart from natural fertilization. That's immoral in the Church's doctrine, and an important church document, which is
Donum Vitae, 1987.
1987.